It's a great pleasure to introduce John von Bergen, who is a graduate from SVA. Actually, he was in my Ideas in Art class. He graduated from SVA in 1996 and now lives in Berlin. SVA is starting a summer program in Berlin this summer. Those of you who are in the third year might want to watch the bulletin boards, etc. John will be part of that program, which we will be exploring the city of Berlin as a visual essay. I also see our faculty of Steve Ellis, who lived in Germany for a while and has written about German art for Art in America. Niels Karsten, who you may know, who is also from Germany, who teaches in our department. And we have several other faculty members. So we have this thing going with Germany, and maybe John can explain why Germany.
Thanks, and thanks for coming tonight. I guess, first of all, just to answer that question, yeah, I moved to Berlin in 2003, and to be honest with you, the main reason was love. I fell in love with a German girl, so that was one of the main reasons. And then there was, of course, a lot of practical reasons to go with that, which came down to the logistics of being an artist and being able to have an easier time to concentrate on my work. I lived in New York for quite some years. I had been, by 2003, I had been living in New York for almost 13 years, and towards the end of that time, there was definitely a higher proportion of energy going into paying rent than making work, and this was something that was really becoming a problem. So I knew already about Berlin. I had some contacts in Germany in the art scene, not too many, but having the girlfriend, of course, made it easier to give it a shot and to settle in. When I went over there, it wasn't exactly easy the first few months, or I should say even the first half year. It was pretty tricky. I was working in a very small apartment. I didn't have a studio, and I didn't really have much money at all. And things, took some time to develop, but now I've been there 5.5 years, pretty much, and pretty settled. Like it a lot. So that answers that. I'm gonna start actually with a project which actually I did when I was still a student here. This is a sculpture called The Conversation. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Is it all right? Yeah. It's better? Yeah? All right. Good to know. The Conversation I did between 95 and 96, and actually finished it just before being in a group show that was curated by Peter Dudek called Thriller, and this was at the Visual Arts Gallery in Soho at the time. What it involves is sculpture where there are these two mouths opposing each other and hooked up to motors that would chatter the whole time during the exhibition time. There was the first mouth, which was actually cast from my own mouth. This is actually epoxy, paint, thread, and people always ask me, where'd you get the teeth? What is that for teeth? And the teeth are actually plastic teeth that I found in a dental supply shop, and they fit perfectly in the mold, and it worked. So this was one mouth, and the second mouth I sculpted. This is made out of Sculpey, this clay that you bake in an oven. Also with the similar materials of epoxy and thread and paint. And what would happen is the small mouth, which was hooked up to a jigsaw, chattered really fast for a few seconds. And then every time that one stopped, the large mouth would open and close once a minute. So it was very slow. And this would continuously happen throughout the whole time. And I actually got very lucky that it never really broke down. It worked quite consistently, even though I had not much experience with kinetic works or doing things with mechanics. I was just playing around with it at that point. But it was also, for me, a kind of seminal piece because it was the first time I was starting to feel like there was a combination of things happening, especially psychologically, which I hadn't really felt I was getting at earlier. At this time, I had really been paying a close attention to Tim Hawkinson. He had a huge solo show at Ace Gallery while I was producing this, and there was a number of other artists too who started becoming really informative, like Bruce Nauman and Charles Ray, a lot of people from the West Coast. And I was really impressed with how they were able to inject humor into their work, and I found that really refreshing, and also in a way that they were able to do it in an intelligent way, where their projects were complex, and they evoked a number of different things, which interested me quite a bit. So this kind of became a foundation for me, which has kind of stayed with me since this time. And just as a further note, the piece had been in a group show actually a few years after at Roebling Hall when they were still in Brooklyn. And I had decided to change the timing of the jigsaw. So it was actually, it was going off more erratically, and actually it wasn't a back and forth constantly, and it became almost a different piece completely at that point. It evolved into something that was almost like an anti-communication, where the mouths were doing their own thing in a very strange, erratic way, and I somehow felt like that was an even more interesting solution. This next project was actually the first sculpture I did when I finished studying. It was in a group show at Hunter College. I didn't study there, but I was invited to be in a group show there. And it's called Passive Ambition, and what I did was I took a plastic skeleton, like an anatomy skeleton, and I took the leg apart, and I hooked it up from the ceiling, and I created steel armatures that created the effect of it being attenuated. So it looked like it was being stretched or melting, or there was a number of different connotations that I guess you could apply to this, but by the time you got to the toe, it was actually touching a cement base. So it fit down pretty much to the millimeter in the space. It was going from floor to ceiling, and it was a solid piece. It wasn't at all bendable, or even though it appeared to be. And in the end, it was painted, so it had this very finished look. So you wouldn't see so much how it was made. And this aspect of illusion had been really interesting to me. It was really a bit of a challenge as to how much I can play around with this visual effect, this kind of trickery when you first see something. This is actually a pretty special piece. This is also a pretty extreme piece. It's something I also did around that time. Actually, I think it was around '98. It's called The Final Stretch, and it's made out of wax and steel bolts. And at this point, it was becoming more of a curiosity and a challenge to me as to how extreme I can make an image, how far can I take something concerning the effect of seeing something that was completely repelling or grotesque, but yet had a kind of complexity to it. I'll back up a minute. It's 36 inches across, and it was sculpted in clay and then cast in wax with different colored wax, and then the bolts were just stuck into it, and it was put on the wall. And it's actually still, to this day, kind of a tough piece for me to look at, but there was something clicking at this time, and there was definitely a need to try to think about things that were pushed towards the extreme. This is another project which relates to it, and this was actually installed in my apartment in the East Village. And it's also wax and steel. It's called transmogrification. And with both pieces, unfortunately, because of the wax I was using, it was they're both destroyed. the white and skin-colored wax actually all faded to red, and I didn't know enough about wax or conservation at the time, and you know, it was a material I was just starting to work with, but then I noticed that you can't really trust it, or at least the kinds of waxes I was using at the time. But at this point, with this project, it was really a curiosity to see how I can take over a space, or what can happen in a space, and create something that was much more less of an object on a pedestal, or less of an object, but more installation, more affecting a space that one is in. But that project actually became a bit of a stepping stone for this one. This is called the Anti-Precious Moment. This was done in 2001. It was, I was invited to be in a 3-person show in Chelsea, a gallery that's no longer there, called Silverstein Gallery. And this was an installation that was put together in different pieces, quite a complicated construction. There was, this plexi case, and the object actually connected, and it all had to be spackled on site. And the red material is actually flocking. And I had to figure out a way to apply it to the interior of the pedestal. And the main part of the installation was, it was the first time I was using this material called aqua resin. It's a polymer gypsum, and it worked out really well. It was a lot of spackling, but it worked. Yeah. Anyway. The ironic thing was actually during the time of this show, there had been a gallery adjacent to this gallery. Andrew Krebs actually was next door, and he had an installation by Ricci Albenda, and it was it's very similar in terms of like having a white wall turn into something, and it really. When I first saw that he had a show, I was just like, oh, Jesus, what's going on here? This is great, you know, like perfect. It's so formally similar to what I was doing. And then I had some relief by reading the press release, and it was quite elaborate, and it got into a lot of his background, which was relating much more to math and geometry. And then this was somehow comforting to know that his starting point was so different than my starting point, that there would be, you know, that we could have this moment of crossing over and having, you know, this formal dialogue that's similar, but yet conceptually there's a fairly different agenda. So this is actually one of the first pieces I did after moving to Berlin. I'm jumping ahead a couple of years because I don't want to actually show you everything I made over the course of 12 years. We'd be here for a while. So I'm jumping around a bit, but it's actually mostly chronological. This piece is not titled, but it's actually one of the first things I did when I got to Berlin. As I was mentioning, I was working in my apartment. I didn't have much space. And before moving to Berlin, I actually had started to get involved in doing some things that were dealing with natural forms opposed to trying to reference anatomy. And I was doing some objects based on found objects in nature. And some of them had an aspect of success. This one is one of the more successful ones, I think. It was also slightly different. It was a slightly different language, of course, than what I had been doing before, but it also felt really healthy to do it because it felt like it was a new muscle I was able to start stretching to a certain degree. But what you're looking at is a tree branch that I actually had found in Berlin and some bones that were given to me actually from a taxidermist. And I had assembled them together with epoxy and then finished them and painted them. So it really looked quite realistic. That it looked like, you know, if you get really up close, you can see that that looks like the tree is becoming bone. And there was another project I did, which was actually a cow skull that I found in New Mexico when I was traveling at one point. And I brought that to Berlin, and I turned it inside out, and I reassembled it and painted it so it had more the effect of fossil, perhaps. Again, like I was saying, there was a curiosity in terms of, you know, natural forms that were going through some kind of transformation that in some ways relate to some of the earlier projects, but was curious about to what degree they can morph or transform or become something else, and how this can have a life of its own, especially if the materials are found objects and they have their own characteristics that are still relevant to the project. So it was a slightly different approach to just making a cast or doing something from a mold. But around that time also I started a drawing series which occupied me for quite a few years. A drawing series is called UFO-UMIS, which is a reference, it's actually, how do I put it? It's an acronym from Umberto Baccioni sculpture, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. And what I did was I just changed some of these words around, and I made UFO-UMIS, decided to title all the drawings this one expression. And it's just pencil on paper, but it involves a process that's dealing with first having an object that's not organic, and it ends up becoming photographed through a macro lens, and at this stage a kind of abstraction begins to happen, and I started to notice it starts to get farther away from its original look, its original aesthetic. And then by the time I make a pencil on paper drawing, and it usually takes quite some hours to make each drawing because they're rendered quite intensely, it becomes more abstracted, and a lot of natural references start to come up, a lot of natural textures start to evolve. And with each drawing, what I do is I try to play around with the design or the characteristic of how it's going to be formatted on paper. These are all roughly, what are they about? The smallest one I do is 18 by 24, and this one is about, you'll have to forgive me. Actually, one problem about living in Europe is you forget feet and inches really fast. I'm always in metric. So it's like 69 by 102 centimeters, and that makes it about 30 by 40 inches. So sorry about that. This is one of the bigger ones I did. This is roughly, it's over 8 feet long. And then this is the largest one I've made out of the series, which is actually over 11.5 feet long. And if I zoom in, you start to see, yeah, some of the textures. So this was actually the first solo show I had in Berlin. It was in 2005. The show was titled UFO-UMIS. And what I did at that time, too, is I actually decided to make a small installation, even though it was predominantly drawings in the exhibition. And the installation was called Tobowag. It was actually a question, also an acronym, where it's going back to some of the projects I had been doing earlier, where the wall is starting to morph and become something different. It starts to take on a kind of rubber characteristic. But this is actually made out of polyurethane, and then it's spackled in and painted. And I built it as an addition, actually. It was a lot easier to, from the way I designed the mold. So I actually, was able to have it for sale much cheaper than an original. But regardless, the characteristic of having something that was slightly abstract, or you could say it's a cylindrical form, and thinking about it, of the connotations that could come out of it, and what it could start to refer to, and somehow the word trophy and the word barrel was in my mind, and I just decided to play around with that for the title and see how the reaction would be. In 2006, I was invited to have an exhibition at a gallery in Duesseldorf called Galerie Schmela. It's a very strange space. It's this is not my work, by the way. These are reference photos of another show, but I had gone there and taken pictures and tried to spend some time meditating over the space, because it's very atypical for a gallery. It was built in the 70s by a gallerist named Alfred Schmela, who's quite a figure in Germany. He really did a lot to bring over American artists. He's like first person to show Richard Tuttle, I think, and was one of the first people in Germany to show Joseph Beuys. And so there's a very long and intense history for the gallery. So I was invited to do a project in fall of 2006, and I went there and I took photos and I looked around, and you know, there's some interesting things about the space, about the architecture, because you can see there's marble floors, there's this strange gray brick which is imported from Holland, and I wasn't allowed to put any holes in the floor or the walls. There's no windows, by the way. So you're actually in a cellar, and like you're in there, and you're like, well, what's going on? And you know, when I see paintings in there, I mean, like, they represent some big people like Zygmunt Polka, and you know, but I look at the work, and it's just swallowed up by the space, and I was really nervous about that, and I didn't know how something would work. So I spent some time meditating over it, and I decided to work on a group of installations that would be scattered around and all play off the space in a very different way, so it wasn't just one consistent thing, though there were consistencies to the project, or the different projects. So the show is called SUBLIMATOR, and what I started with was actually this switch. This was actually in my studio in Berlin, in Friedrichshain neighborhood. It had been an old factory, and I didn't know what these switches were, but there are these huge machine switches everywhere, and they were quite strange. They weren't hooked up to anything. I had no idea what they were for. They didn't function. What I did was I cast them, or I cast the heads that you see here. These are the original. And what I did was I made 3 variations of them. I titled the project Family Shades of Gray. And they were built with this stem that went into an outlet, and so it actually plugged into the wall, but it was just an object. It didn't serve any function at all. So there were 3 versions of them. Here's a close-up. And they were cast in solid polyurethane. And I made the addition all in time for the opening. There was 15 of them altogether, I think. Yeah, and they were scattered around. And they basically took away all possible use of the outlets. So there was no way to use the electrical outlets in the space, which became a bit strange at one point, because there was a cleaning person that came, and like, she had to plug in a vacuum cleaner or something. And I remember, yeah, they told me it was a funny moment. This is what they look like before being installed. And actually, I just have to point out that it was a nightmare making this project. I do all my work myself, almost everything I fabricate on my own, because I'm kind of obsessed with mold making, so I've gotten really into it, and sometimes have assistants helping me in my studio. But when I was working on this project, it was pretty crazy, because I used a silicone that was not the most expensive one, and I ran into some problems. It got somehow, I don't know what, but the polyurethane got moisture contamination. There was some really complicated science thing happening, which was creating these bubbles they were driving me insane. And I had a very tight window of time because of this to finish them. And I had to kind of come up with a new process for casting them. And I wasted a ton of material. I had absolutely no time to rebuild the molds. In the end, it worked out fine. It just took an enormous amount of energy, and I had to get strategic to think about a new process. So I could say that when it comes to working with things like mold making, you could never give yourself enough time to figure out how to do something. I really thought I knew what was happening, but then all of a sudden this moisture contamination thing came up, and it just really became a nightmare. This project is titled I Don't Believe in Good and Evil, but I Keep Them Both Around. There are 2 symmetrical abstract forms, good being towards the ceiling and evil, of course, being towards the floor. And what I had done was I cast the brick. I wasn't allowed to, put holes in the wall and start really ripping through the wall, which would have been tempting. But I used a special silicone, and I actually cast the brick, brought this back to Berlin, and then recreated sections of the wall, which took an enormous amount of time, and I had an assistant help me with that, and it would have been actually much smarter in hindsight to just buy more silicone and take a big piece of the wall. But we rebuilt sections of the wall, then made a new mold, and here's the detail of it. And then there were these forms that were sculpted, and they were installed. So there was a slight visual play of the wall actually peeling like a rubber or a skin. So the first glance, you'd be like, "What's going on here? What is that?" And then you get up close, and it's obvious, you know, that it's plastic and it's painted. I wasn't trying to make it so hyper-realistic. It was more about the first glance when you're walking into the space. Anyway, this is one of the main projects from the show. Also, this is called Terrible Uncertainty. When I was younger, I played drums in heavy metal bands. I decided to bring my drum set over to Germany, and at the same time, I bought a big shipment of aqua resin, of this polymer gypsum. So it was all shipped over. Again, while I was in the middle of all the chaos of the switches and the polyurethane contamination, I was waiting for things to get through customs. And it arrived in Hamburg and had to get through customs, and then it had to be shipped to a warehouse in Berlin. By the time I finally picked it up, you know, it was really tight on time, but I somehow figured out how to do this project. This required probably almost 50 molds. It was every last screw, every last detail of the bass drum and the pedal was cast. So even the details inside the pedal, there was like 12 molds, I think, just for the pedal. So it was a slightly obsessive amount of energy, and in the end it worked out. The entire thing came together with magnets, actually. And I use magnets all the time because it's an extreme convenience when it comes to putting things together. It's just absolutely makes more sense than making the sculpture solid and then having to fix it every time you transport it. So I'm a big fan of magnets. This is one of the final projects from the installation. This is actually the office of the gallery. It's a project called Sublimating, and these are bronze candle holders that were actually my mom's, and I stole them, and I brought them over to Germany and cast them. And what I did was, they're actually huge. They're from Singapore. They stand like, the candle holder's it's like up to here or something, and then with the candle, it's almost like a cartoon of it's almost a cartoon of itself. It's really funny. So what I did was I made a cast of it, and I cast them in different colored polyurethanes and set them up facing each other from floor to ceiling. And in the middle, what I did was I made intentionally failed casts, so I had the mold, and I wanted to let the polyurethane set up just as it was going through the mold, and I got these very strange forms, which at the time interested me because I really started thinking too about the natural abstraction that happens from wax melting. Of course, everyone's seen this 100 times. And I was just curious, like, what would happen if all of a sudden the implication of a melted wax that was being referenced to was actually made of a different material that had its own nature of becoming abstract somehow. And I can't articulate it exactly in terms of what I thought people should be thinking when they see it. It was really more about the effect and the strangeness of the effect, and that these two objects could also relate as one thing from a distance, and then when you get up close, you realize that they are separate. They're actually not touching, but they have some symmetry and some kind of relationship to each other. And this relationship to me was complicated, and it interested me. And what I did was, after deciding on this project, I made a solid cast of the candle and one section of the candle holder, and I installed it in the back courtyard of the space. This one's called Lonely Only, and it's just in the corner. And most people didn't see it at the show, but it was just there. It was like it was a perfect cast, and it was just there on its own. So here we are back in my studio. This is the beginning of 2007. And I had noticed a crack in the wall of my space. And for some reason, I always had the idea that it could be interesting to try to reproduce this crack and have it in another space, in another context. What would that mean? What could that be? And around that time, I had been invited to do a residency at a wonderful space in Dresden called Siebter Stock, which means 7th floor. They invited me for a few weeks just to live and work there, and I took advantage of it. I had done residencies before in the States. I had been to Yaddo and McDowell, and I thought, okay, this would be really cool to check out Dresden because I'd never been there before. And what I did was, before leaving, I had the idea that maybe it'd be possible to do this project there. And so I made a cast of this in latex rubber and rolled it up, put it in my suitcase with a bunch of other materials, some drawing paper, and went down there, spent a couple of weeks. This is a close-up of what it looks like. And this is the building I was working in. And I got to know the people, and I got to see, how things were going in Dresden. And what I did was, towards the end of my stay there, I asked them if it was possible that I put a crack in their wall, and they were like, yeah, sure. And so I basically found a spot that was not so occupied because they have elevators in the building, and I found a part of the stairway where, not much is happening. And overnight, or basically overnight, I had first prepared by making a polyurethane cast of it there, using the sand dust of the sandstone of the walls that were in the architecture. So there was some realistic component to it. But then overnight, I chiseled out the form, and then basically the next day, it was painted, and there was this crack from my studio that showed up in Dresden. And that's what they look like. And this was also a quite important project for me because it was something that was so independent of doing projects in galleries and things that were clearly in an art context. So this was something where it was almost like not announced. There was no opening. There was no, predicted audience, and it was a project that I was happy enough to have permission to do, to try out and to document, so I can show it to others. But what turned out to be kind of funny was that there was some word got out among some friends, and at one point I got an email from my friend Nicole, who lives in Berlin. She was visiting in Dresden, and she sent me this tourist photo of her with the crack, and I thought that was really sweet. I had to show this. So there's Nicole standing next to my crack in Dresden. She emailed that to me, and I was touched. I was touched by that. So this is the first of the last group of images I'm showing, which is from my last solo show in Berlin. The show is called The Itch, and this was in 2007. And this project is called Eben, which is a German word, which I guess you translate to even. It has a couple of meanings in German. It's, almost like someone says something and you agree, you'd be like Eben, like, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Or it's like equal, it basically translates to even or equal. So what's happening is there's a handle that was sculpted. It was actually, I started working on this in Dresden, actually, and the sculpted handle is attached to a form that you're not really sure what it is, though it could imply that it's from a piece of architecture or part of a wall. But the entire thing is cast in polymer gypsum with real bolts connecting it there. And when I first made the object, I really liked how it was coming along because it just had this strange autonomous quality to it, but it didn't really feel like enough of a presence or an effect. And I came up with the idea to have a glass table and have it fabricated where it was morphed to the form. So the two surfaces of the glass right here and the surface of the attached form would be even. So the glass actually was fabricated in Czech Republic, and this was a real experience. I had to go to this small village in the Czech Republic. I couldn't find any glass blower in Germany to do this, actually. I sent sketches. I explained exactly what I needed. I wanted it to be over 1 meter big. I needed it to be about almost a centimeter thick. And everyone said, no, why don't you make it smaller? And I was like, no, it's got to be that size. And I met so much resistance, and then finally I got a hold of this guy that someone recommended in this little village. He spoke no English, so we had to speak German, which was really interesting. But he basically was like, yeah, we could try it. We could do this. And it turned out to be phenomenally cheaper than having it done in Germany because, you're not spending euros and a number of reasons. So I traveled out there and I had this thing made, which was a hell of an experience, but it worked out in the end. And it worked out in time for the show. This is a shot from underneath. And this next shot I really like a lot. Actually, I just found this recently. It really looks like it's swimming in water or something. There's there's actually graphite, liquid graphite that was painted at the bottom of the surface, so it has this almost strange metallic effect when you see it. It's not so clear in the slide. This is an installation that was in the same show called Chase. It's over 11 feet tall in the space and goes back to this type of architectural intervention I had been playing with before. The entire right side of the wall was spackled to three sections of this, which kind of came together again like a puzzle. And then there's actual bolts on the end. What I like about it in hindsight is how it has this strange Baroque presence, even though it takes up very little square feet. It's a very small gallery, and it was a way to do a project that had some substance without having to dominate the space, or you didn't have trouble walking around it. And it's also nice because from different angles it really becomes something slightly different. And it had to become, it was destroyed, so at the end of the show, I saved it actually. I tried to save some pieces, but actually the top part was like impossible to save, so it just ended up in the garbage afterward. Which I should say is okay. I mean, I'm not making projects all the time that are necessarily geared for the art market. I mean, there's a lot of things that really exist primarily for the experience, for my experience, or for trying to see what kinds of questions come up from doing them. So it's not necessarily about always having to put something in a space that's, in the end, necessary to sell. And this is the last image I'm showing tonight. This is a piece called Ghost. And in many respects, it was the project that took the least amount of energy and money from the show, but it created the most conversation. It had the most reaction, which was quite a nice surprise. It is actually a cavalry saber that had been my grandfather's, and it was brought over to Germany, like everything. And what I did was I took it and covered it with aluminum foil and then coated it with this polymer gypsum material as well as fiberglass, and it was spackled into the wall, so it was kind of like halfway in the wall. And what it became was this strange thing where a lot of times people just assumed it was a cast, and as soon as you tell them it's really in there, they have a hard time believing that, and then they start to, it's really interesting. It really had a strange resonance, and of course a lot of people would believe it, and maybe some people wouldn't. And people would be asking, why is it near the floor and all this, and a lot of different issues came out from it. And I think also it had such a presence, and when you tell people too, it's from United States Cavalry, and the way the political landscape is viewed from Germany, it's really interesting. It just automatically, people do want to start talking politics. It's really amazing, which makes me think that actually recently I was there for the election. I got here just after the election, and there was an enormous amount of congratulating to me and people sending emails and text messages congratulating. Which is really sweet and really interesting, because there had been a lot of disappointment with what was going on in the States from the people I got to know, especially in Berlin. So anyway, it's just funny because the project opens up a lot of things. It opens up some questions of reality and whether it's really there or not. These questions of sentimentality actually came up, especially, oh, it's your grandfather's, and what does that mean? And then, of course, yeah, the references that aren't even so much intentional, but people start coming to it from their own perspective, from their own history, and that to me is really nice. That's a reward when those kinds of things start to come up from the projects. So that's it, and thank you.